Hey everyone, welcome to the last session of the day. Thanks for joining me. In this session, we'll be talking about the process needed to navigate a Drupal upgrade from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9. Not going to be very developer focused on how to actually perform the migration in this session. We focus more on the process and what you can do to kind of prepare yourself and have a smooth time while you're upgrading. Feel free to use the Q&A feature as I'm speaking, or I'll try to keep my eye on the chat as well. And if you have a question that's relevant to kind of what we're talking about at that moment, feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt me. I don't mind having that kind of interactive experience as well. To introduce myself, I'm Brian Tofty Schumacher. I'm a technical architect at Forum One, based out in Seattle. And I've been working with Drupal for about 4.5 years. So most of my experience has actually been with building Drupal 8 sites, and a lot of experience migrating content from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. Now also migrating some sites from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9. My pronouns are he, him. And if at any time you want to get in touch with me after this presentation, feel free to reach out via email or on Twitter. Just to say a little bit about Forum One, we're a digital agency that's been around for about 25 years, and we focus on partnering with nonprofit organizations and government agencies to achieve a lasting impact. So our agenda today, hopefully this will be useful whether you're planning to do your Drupal upgrade in-house or you're planning to partner with an outside team. My goal really is to give kind of an overview of a typical project that I've worked on, some of the activities and kind of the process I follow. I think I've done 3 or 4 government-specific migrations at this point. So we'll talk about who should be on your team, what skills do those people need, like I said, what process you should follow and what activities you should do to set yourself up for success. And since we're upgrading a site, I'm also going to try and weave in ways you can think about using data from your current site, your current audience, to inform how you're going to build your Drupal 9 site. I'm sure this goes without saying, but the reason why we're here, why we're having this conversation, is because Drupal 7 end of life is scheduled for November 28, 2022. At that time, there will be no more security updates for Drupal 7, though there will be an option to subscribe for long-term support for Drupal 7 from November 2022 until November 2025. I kind of think of that as putting your site on life support if you just absolutely don't have the capacity to upgrade to Drupal 9. Though oftentimes I think that money would be better spent by investing in actually upgrading the site. So if we're talking about upgrade to Drupal 9, kind of what does that mean? And really, why do you have to, why is there an upgrade process? Why isn't it just an update process? There's some significant changes between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8, and I'll say Drupal 9 for the most part, but I might accidentally say Drupal 8, but Drupal 8 actually is end of life this month. So when Drupal 8 was released, Drupal switched to using the Symfony framework, which changes the way a lot of the code has to be written. And also, there are changes to how data is actually stored in the database. Plus, there's plenty of new features introduced with Drupal 8 that you could take advantage of. Thinking about Layout Builder, Media Library, if you're not already using paragraphs in Drupal 7. And then also the way themes are written for Drupal 8 and 9 is completely different than how it was written in Drupal 7, using the Twig templating system. And since you have to rewrite the theme anyway, I think of that as a great time for either a brand refresh or a complete redesign. And something you might consider redoing the theme is taking a component-based approach to your site. And I've kind of weaved that into this conversation as well. And lastly, modules. You'll have to rewrite any custom modules to make sure they're using object-oriented principles and they're using kind of based on the Symfony framework rather than all of the hooks and custom code that was written in Drupal 7. And then there's also contrib modules. A lot of contrib modules have direct upgrade path from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, but some of them were replaced, some were migrated into core, some were replaced with other contrib modules. So there's those three aspects that we need to upgrade, and we'll keep all those in mind as we continue on. So there's kind of three approaches when I think about upgrading a site. There's like a fully automated migration approach. Basically, what this would mean is with the Drupal 8 migration or Drupal 9 migration suite, there's modules you can install that will look at your Drupal 7 site, generate the migration configuration, and then actually create configuration to create content types and any other entities in Drupal 9 that are supported by Migration Suite, and it would just automatically create all of that structure for you in the Drupal 9 site. It's a great way to approach it if you are not using kind of any advanced layout functionality in Drupal 7 like Panelizer, and as long as you're not using any features or modules that were deprecated between Drupal 7 and Drupal 9. I've never actually seen a site that was able to take this fully automated approach, but this also would mean that your content model pretty much would stay exactly the same unless you modify the migration process. The next kind of type of migration approach that you might consider is one that I call hybrid, where you use those automated tools to kind of generate the initial configuration for the migration, but then you make adjustments to those manually. Maybe you add some of your own logic through custom plugins in order to move the content from fields in Drupal 7 to different entities or different fields in Drupal 9. And then there's a completely manual approach, which means you would just ignore all the tools for kind of automatically upgrading Drupal, and you would manually rebuild your content types and manually re-enter all your content into the new site. I think this was really only feasible if you have like a small site with a little bit of content, or a large site with an army of content creators. And there is an opportunity here. It's an opportunity for folks to become familiar with how content is created in the new site. So if you do take this approach, you could think of the silver lining as you'll really be familiar with your Drupal site once you're done with the manual migration. For the purposes of this call, and because most of the projects that I've actually participated in have used the hybrid approach, I'm going to focus on that as we're moving through the discussion today. And a reminder, this allows you to do things like moving data that might have been stored in a content type in Drupal 7 into a taxonomy in Drupal 8 or Drupal 9. Confession, I never built sites in Drupal 7, but I don't think taxonomies in Drupal 7 allowed you to have extra fields, whereas in Drupal 9 they do. So that's like a common thing that I see. People had created a content type that really was trying to act as a taxonomy, but they needed to add some extra data to it. This would also allow you to do something like migrate from Panelizer to Layout Builder if you needed to. I did that for EPA.gov. It's a whole other conversation and process. I actually did give a presentation about that at Drupal Camp Asheville last year in 2020. It requires a lot of custom code, but the migration suite does help. So if you do have features in your Drupal 7 site that don't have a direct path for migration in Drupal 9, it is possible without manually migrating everything, but it will take some planning and probably some custom code to do it. So the next part that I'd like to talk about, so before you start really digging into the project, is assembling a team. I think there's really 4 kind of expertise areas that are important to have in an upgrade project: content, design, technology, and a project manager. From the content perspective, during the upgrade process, you can seek input about kind of what content do people wish they could have published in Drupal 7, but they were limited and they couldn't. You could also like start to plan your content strategy to inform your content model for Drupal 9. From design, if you're going to rewrite the theme, like I said, it's a good time to introduce a rebrand or a complete redesign. So important to have user experience designers and visual designers present for that. This is also a great time to consider accessibility. If your Drupal 7 site needs some improvements to make sure it's fully accessible. And then from the tech perspective, generally you like to have a front-end developer, a back-end developer, and a technical architect. Maybe it's a little selfish to say you need a technical architect since that's my role, but I think the technical architect really takes the 30,000-foot view and is a good person to interface with stakeholders and kind of everyone on the team and bring that Drupal knowledge and make sure everyone is kind of speaking the same language, and let the front-end developers and the back-end developers do the actual implementation work. Not to say technical architects shouldn't code too. And then obviously project manager is always helpful, the glue that binds the team together. I feel like I could use a project manager for every aspect of my life. As you're preparing for this migration process, this upgrade process, some questions that you might think about. Thanks, Sebastian. From the content strategy and design, kind of what content is resonating with your audiences? Does the current site represent your brand? What kinds of content do you wish you could publish but can't publish with the current site? I feel like this is an opportunity really to identify pain points that you might have experienced with your Drupal 7 site. Think about, are there situations where you've had to break the rules and publish content using custom HTML instead of being able to use Drupal's tools to create what you need? From the technical architecture and information architecture perspective, think about, does your content model need an update? What functionality is essential for the new website? Are there other systems that should be integrated into your website? During this process, you're going to be rewriting a lot of code and upgraded modules, so it's a great time to introduce additional functionality or kind of standardize on new features and functionality that were introduced in Drupal 9. And then lastly, I like to think about team development. There's enough differences between Drupal 7 and Drupal 9 that it's important to ask, like, is your team familiar with the new tools that are in D9? Mostly I think of Layout Builder, paragraphs, the media library, but there's a bunch of great stuff in Drupal 9 to kind of be aware of and consider as you're planning to build your site. Are the front-end developers familiar with Twig? That'll be a huge advantage to them if they can take some time to become familiar with it before they start creating the theme, if they're not already. And then are the backend developers familiar with object-oriented programming? Like I said, I never actually wrote any code for Drupal 7, but I find the object-oriented principles in Drupal 9 to be very intuitive, and it makes it really easy to extend and build in custom functionality on your site. All right, kind of the last step in this before we start actually preparing for the migration is to define a process. Kind of the first step that I always like to do is go through a product requirements process. In that time, I like to just take a step back and document what functionality and what content do we actually want to publish on the site. It's time to think about your integrations as well. And then once you have all of that well-defined, then you could go into the visual and UX design process, where you're kind of bringing wireframes to life with the visual design. It's really small. I can't actually read what I've written here. I think back in step 1, I also recommend you create a content model, and we'll dive into that a little bit. But when you get to the visual design, you could actually validate the content model and make sure the design lines up with which fields you've thought you might need in step 1, and then kind of it's like a feedback loop for your content model to make sure everything aligns with design. And then you actually get into development, where you actually build the Drupal 9 site, configure the migration, and update all your custom code and install the modules. So all that is kind of like getting ready, getting in the right mindset, preparing for, or guess this is the step where you're preparing to prepare. So in this section, we'll just talk a little more in depth about the artifacts that you might create and what tools you might use to prepare to build the Drupal 9 site. Something that I find really helpful at the start of a project when I'm upgrading a Drupal 7 site is to perform a content inventory. Usually I rely on a content strategist and UX designer on our teams to create these. And I've created this little matrix here where on the vertical axis we have engagement, and on the horizontal axis we have content importance. And engagement could really mean anything. However you want to measure engagement. It could be time on page, page views, actions taken from a page. And really the goal is to figure out, from my perspective, from your Drupal 7 to Drupal 9 upgrade, how can you move those that content that has high importance but low engagement into the high engagement kind of quadrant of this matrix. And ideally, you're going to pull a report from your analytics tool to help take a data-informed approach to understanding how your current content is performing. That could mean just doing an export from Google Analytics and then, arranging based on page views, and then kind of comparing, okay, well, this is the number of views versus the number, like how I view the importance of this page. It's also really an opportunity to conduct interviews with your audience to see why some of that high importance content might have low engagement. Really just a time to think about the content on your website holistically and validate the product requirements that you've written so far. And speaking of product requirements, before I ever start building an actual site, I like to have a list of user stories and these are high-level user stories, don't necessarily define like acceptance criteria or the technical implementation for these different pieces of functionality. But usually I, as the technical architect, will meet with stakeholders, and stakeholders could mean content creators, could mean developers on the team, could mean like kind of your organization's leadership, to get an understanding of what features and functionality the site needs. And the areas that I like to think about are user roles and permissions, views and listing pages. I feel like those always get left for last, so it's important to make sure you're documenting what you need to build. Search, workflows, media library, and integrations. And I also think of the content model itself as a product requirement. I didn't list it here. We're going to talk about that on the next slide. But in addition to the product requirements, I feel like a content model is really important to ensuring success for an upgrade project. Maybe a from scratch project as well, but especially for an upgrade project. So then another artifact, like I said, is developing a content model. And usually the UX designer and the technical architect would partner on this. Basically, it's a big spreadsheet that lists out all of our content types, our paragraphs, taxonomies, or media entities. Sometimes we even include view modes. And you can see I get pretty detailed in my content model, including things like the machine name and the description. I find that if I don't write the description for some of these fields, or what might show up as help text, during this stage of the kind of planning process, then we don't consistently apply help text or provide. Oh, sorry, David, you're asking if the slides are one behind. It should say develop a content model. Is that what you're seeing? Let me know in the chat if you're not seeing the develop a content model slide. But essentially, what I was saying is making sure you're still on document project requirements. Is anyone else seeing the develop a content model slide? Okay, perfect. Great. Thank you for confirming. Anyway, I think I might have covered everything I wanted to say here. I find the content models useful for the design phase, the site building phase, and the migration phase. Oh, and one other thing to add here, I didn't include these columns because it can be a little bit well, I guess the screenshot just wasn't big enough, but I also like to map fields from Drupal 7 to their new field in Drupal 9. So I would just add additional columns to the right here. That's really helpful, especially if you're kind of combining content types or moving things from fields on a content type into a paragraph. When you get to the migration, it's really helpful to know what the source of the content that should be imported into Drupal 9 actually is. Alrighty. And then this last step in our preparing section, which doesn't have to happen right away, but I wanted to include it here so you could start thinking about it before you start building the site. But basically, once you have a good idea of what you're going to build in Drupal 9, then you have a better idea of what you can clean up in Drupal 7. And this will really be helpful if this is completed before you start your final migration. But basically, you can delete old content and set up redirects, delete old user accounts, make a list of unique content. The goal with making this list of the unique content is identifying if it either needs to be manually migrated or if it could be standardized in your new site. And I guess that step really is important before you start the migration, because if you're going to standardize your content, you need to know basically how you're going to transform that during the migration process. And it's also good to do this list so that you know how much manual migration is going to be needed, and you can start making sure you have your timeline and resources ready and available to do that. All right, so in this next phase, we'll talk about actually building the site and getting the content migration set up, using all of those tools that you've created to help yourself get to this point. So the first step, once you have your D9 development environment set up, is where you can start building the site. And since we're using that hybrid approach, we're going to manually build all of the entity types in Drupal. And I like to start kind of in this order that I have listed here, because I feel like it kind of starts from an atomic level or the smallest level. Like taxonomies usually don't have relationships to other well, they do have relationships, but they don't have dependencies on other content types. So it's easy to create a taxonomy and maybe come back and add any relationship fields that you want to add on the taxonomy later. And then set up media entities, create your paragraphs if you're going to use paragraphs. I'm a big fan of paragraphs because it allows a component-based approach to your site building. And what I mean is you can have different building blocks that you can kind of mix and match on the page, so you're not stuck with one specific page template for each content type. And then after you've got your paragraphs created, then you can create your content types. As something I didn't mention on the content model when I was talking about the content model is that I find it also important to include the machine name for my fields on the content model so that I could reuse fields between different content types. And that helps, if you're planning that before you start building out the site, then you don't have to make any of those decisions, and it helps you go a lot faster when you're building your content types if you already know kind of, okay, I'm implementing this field or I'm reusing this field. My whole goal is to make the development phase as smooth as possible and kind of as few questions as you're implementing as possible. And then once you got all your content types built, then that's when you could add on the layer of workflows if you want to use content moderation in Drupal 9. And don't forget to configure all your permissions. Some items that I might have left out here are like meta tags if you want to have good content sharing on social media. There will be some search configuration. You've got to build your views. So I don't mean to make it sound like, oh, your build process is just going to be easy breezy, take one day because you've got all this stuff documented. There is still quite a bit of work to do, but I think if you do that preparation step, it'll help you in the long run and help make the project a little smoother. And then the next step, you'll notice I wrote here when the visual design is completed. I didn't include a slide about visual design because I'm not a designer. I didn't really have any tips to offer that were specific to a D9 upgrade. So once the design is completed, but again, that's using some of those artifacts that we've created, like the product requirements and the content model, then you can start implementing the Drupal 9 theme. Sometimes you can actually start implementing the theme or creating the theme styles before you even build the Drupal 9 content model. At Form 1, we use Pattern Lab or Storybook to kind of create a design system where we're basically creating the styles and templates that will then later integrate with Drupal. And we've actually also found that if we do that before we build the content model in Drupal, that is like the last confirmation step that we've got all our fields correct. If there's any last minute changes to design, once folks start seeing stuff like actually in the context of a website rather than in the context of a static design file, that's another area where you can kind of eliminate rework or kind of change course once you've already built stuff. And if you are going to take that kind of design system component-based approach, then you probably would start with some global components like your header and footer, and then you'd move on to creating some content components, and then putting all those together to design or integrate the styles for your content types. And then the next phase of the build process would be configuring your migration scripts. I'm not sure, I didn't mean to include content creator there. So backend developer really is the person who's going to be configuring your migration scripts. And essentially in this hybrid model, what I would do, how I would approach it is use the Drupal migrate, I think it's called migrate upgrade command to generate some baseline configuration, and then use that configuration as a starting point. And that configuration basically is a mapping. So the Drupal 9 migrations, think of a source. The source is going to be your Drupal 7 database, and then you're transforming that data. In a lot of cases, you're just pulling that data out from Drupal 7 and putting it into Drupal 9. And then the last step is actually loading it up. Like I said, the migration process, you could have a whole session dedicated to how to perform these migrations. But essentially, once you've got your site built, that's when you can start configuring your migration scripts and testing them. I find that as I'm writing migrations, I have to test and validate, and that's a very iterative process to make sure that content is going into the right place. And then kind of the last step of the build process, we're getting closer to launch here, is actually migrating the content. So by this time, you'd want to ensure that your Drupal 7 manual cleanup is done. The Drupal 7 site that you're going to use as the source is ready to have all its content pulled into Drupal 9. Oftentimes, you're going to want to schedule a content freeze or a double content entry period. And usually that's like, I try to keep it to 2 weeks if I can, but basically the date that I pull the D7 copy of the database for the migration is the date that we're going to either have content editors stop creating content in the D7 site, or they have to know that they're going to have to recreate this in the D9 site once the site migration is done. This is also the time when you'd want to start training your content creators for any manual migration steps, do any final testing and content review, and then you're ready to launch your new site. All right, so once you've got your Drupal 9 site launched and ready to go, it's important to stay up to date. This next slide I actually copied from Dries's State of Drupal presentation that he gave last week at DrupalCon Europe. So you could see here, he's got all the dates here. Drupal 7 will be end of life in 1 year. Drupal 8 will be end of life actually next month. Drupal 10 is targeted to be released in 9 to 14 months. So basically, if you're starting your Drupal 7 upgrade now, you're definitely going to be migrating into Drupal 9 and not Drupal 8 for the most part. And then by the time you launch, it's going to be really close to actually needing an upgrade to Drupal 10. Thankfully, once you're upgraded from Drupal 7 to 8, 9, or 10, the migrations between 8, 9, and 10 get a lot simpler. You don't have to actually rebuild the site and migrate any content. Really, the upgrade is focused on custom code or contributed modules. And the reason for these upgrades is driven by deprecation or end-of-life support for third-party components that Drupal is using now. The main one being Symfony. Also, Twig has its own schedule of end-of-life. And there is a lot of work happening right now. There's a whole Drupal priority area for automated updates. One stat that Dries included in that presentation, he said Drupal 9 to Drupal 10, the progress on the automatic updates initiatives means that a Drupal 9 to Drupal 10 migration is 300% more efficient than the Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 migration. Essentially, there are some tools that help you identify any deprecated code, and in more and more, it will automatically fix those deprecations for you, so you don't actually have to rewrite any code in a lot of cases. But overall, I have done some Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 migrations. They are a lot easier. I think there was some concern as we were entering this new Drupal 8 era that the migrations wouldn't actually be as easy as they were touted, and I'm happy to say they are. And I think that is the end of my presentation, and I think we're right on time. They asked us to speak for about 30 minutes. Does anyone have any questions or comments that you'd like to talk through? And while I give you some time to think about that, I'll look through the chat. Might have missed some stuff here. All right, I'm not seeing any questions come in. I'll hang out here in case anyone does come up with some questions. Oh, maybe there are some. Let's see. What are your thoughts about migrating from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 as an intermediate step on the way to D9? I think at this point, since Drupal 8 is end of life next year, or sorry, next month, maybe, yeah, in November this year, it's not really that different to migrate into Drupal 9 instead of Drupal 8. The only thing that you're starting with is a code base that is based on Drupal 9. There may be some contributed modules that you could have used in Drupal 8 that aren't quite ready for Drupal 9, but I would recommend starting with Drupal 9 if you're starting a migration anytime within the next few months. All right, don't see any more questions, but like I said, I'll hang around if anyone comes up with some more questions. And thank you for your participation and your attention. I love sharing this information, and feel free to get in touch if you need anything.